All right, welcome to the 7th installment of Rochester Street Films. Before we begin, I need to thank all of our 2017 Rochester Street Film sponsors, in particular WXXI, Sun Common, Lori's Natural Food Center, and the American Public Transportation Association. Without their support, we would be unable to host these important community events. Programs like Rochester Street Films enable us to get our message out into the community in a way that sparks conversation and understanding, leading to action and real change. So thanks to our sponsors and thanks to you all for coming out tonight, showing your support, and choosing to join us for this important community conversation. For many people, public transportation is a convenience, but I think every single person in this room knows that public transit is not only a convenience, it's a necessity, and one that is too often taken for granted. Access to just about everything associated with upward mobility and economic progress, including jobs, quality food and goods, healthcare, and schooling, relies on our ability to get around in an efficient way and for an affordable price. Public transportation is uniquely suited to fill that need, and it should be a key ingredient in our effort to reduce poverty in our community. When a person's access to transportation is impaired, whether due to cost or location or time, it makes the process of doing simple things such as caring for children and getting to work on time much more difficult, if not impossible. As a result, the difficulty of climbing out of poverty is only exacerbated. Tonight, we intend to take a critical look at how our transportation and land use policies have impacted working and low-income individuals here in Monroe County. Our program will include a quick presentation on some of the data we have on poverty, job location, and commutes in our region, followed by a short film, and then live conversation with members of our community who live these issues every day, as well as 3 local leaders from the Rochester Anti-Poverty Initiative. I think it's fairly obvious, but nonetheless important to say that this is a very complex set of problems. I've come to learn that it's not as simple as just adding more buses or creating more jobs even. Someone is going to have to pay for those buses to run, and how effective will they be if the jobs are spread out over 600 square miles of land without sidewalks? Although it would be wonderful if we could wave a magic wand, actually connecting all of these dots is much more complicated. So let us not point fingers at other people, and let's not assume that we know what the solution is or that there even is one solution. Before we can make progress, we need to understand certain realities. To do that requires listening to the perspectives of other people and even walking in someone else's shoes for a while. We hope that tonight's program will help give us some of those perspectives and make you curious enough so that you leave here asking even more questions and challenging many of your own preconceptions. So, with all of that in mind, I'd like to introduce one of Reconnect Rochester's team members. Pete Nabozny is the Early Childhood Policy Director for the Children's Agenda, but very recently he was Associate Principal at the Center for Governmental Research. Pete is leading an effort on behalf of Reconnect Rochester to assemble an in-depth report on the connection between transportation and poverty, and that project, we hope, will help to inform the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative and others who are working on these issues in their decision-making process. Tonight, he's here to give us a bit of a primer on the subject before we dive into the film. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Pete Nabozny.
All right. Hi, everyone. Mike introduced it as quick, so I'm going to try to keep it that way. Really, I want to just kind of set some stage and sort of provide some context for the film you're going to watch in a little bit without taking away from that film or any of the panel discussion that we're going to get to in a little bit. So here you have Reconnect Rochester's mission statement here that, and I just want to highlight the vibrant, equitable community. What we're trying to talk about tonight is making a more equitable community. And again, on this next statement, I want to highlight the making a robust transportation network that makes it easy for everyone, regardless of the economic ability. The physical ability is also very important, really highlighting the economic aspect tonight. So first, a little history lesson, which I think a lot of people are probably familiar with. Monroe County, prior to the 1950s, nearly everyone lived in the city of Rochester. There were very few people living in the suburbs. They weren't even really suburbs at that point. And the outlying areas were also pretty non-populated. But starting in the 50s, with the interstate highway system and the construction of that entire enterprise there, as well as as the decades went on, increasing economic and racial segregation in our community, we started to see a flatlining of the overall population from 1970 on. We haven't really grown as a broader community, but the population in the city has shrunk. So over time, we've become increasingly less dense as a community and more spread out across the varying parts of the county here. And more recently, and this data goes back as far as we have it, from 2002 to the present, the location of jobs. So first we lost, the city of Rochester lost residents, but more recently the city of Rochester's lost jobs. Jobs have declined 23%. This is among Monroe County residents where they work. Jobs located within the city have declined by 23% since 2002. Other areas, particularly the sort of outer areas, which I define as the entire county, except for Brighton, Irondequoit, Gates, and Greece, which are the parts of the county that border the city. Those other areas have grown, not a ton, but they've grown. And more recently, we've seen a lot of county residents holding jobs outside of the county. Those are jobs in Victor. Those are jobs, they could be in Batavia, they could be traveling as far as Buffalo, but they're outside of Monroe County. And those are very hard to get to by bus. So downtown, this is a popular graphic here. We've turned downtown into a lot of parking lots surrounded by a couple buildings at times. And so we've made downtown a bit more like the suburbs as time's gone on. And within Monroe County, or the places where jobs have grown within Monroe County, they've really been these outlying suburbs like we're talking about. Henrietta has experienced a pretty good growth in jobs over the last 12 years or so. 2014 is the most recent year we have data, just to highlight that. Jobs in Webster have increased, jobs in Pittsford have increased. Victor's seen a real large growth in jobs. These jobs aren't accessible within our existing public transportation system. And just there at the bottom, we've seen a lot of jobs growing again outside of the county. So this is where jobs are now. This is what it looks like from a topographic view. And those jobs, again, there's a lot of parking lots there, but it's pretty difficult to get there by bus or for a transportation system to really serve those areas effectively. So with that in mind, what does that all have to do with poverty in our region here? Just to kind of put a frame on this, I wanted to look at the definition of poverty. The definition is kind of quirky. It's not a self-sufficiency standard. For most families, self-sufficiency is about double the poverty line. The poverty line was set by looking at the cost of food in the early 1960s, and they've just adjusted it for inflation ever since then. So it's not the best definition, but it's something that we have to go by that stretches back a number of years. But I'll just kind of highlight a couple points. For a single person, a single household person, it's about $12,000 a year. For a family of four, it's about $24,000 a year. That's not a lot of money, and it's certainly not allow someone to be self-sufficient without a lot of assistance. And unfortunately, in our region here, poverty has grown just steadily over time. Looking back at 1990, the poverty rate in the city of Rochester was under 24%, which is still high, but nothing compared to what we've seen in recent years, where it's almost 34%. So 1 in 3 residents in the city living in poverty in 2015. And you will see that in Monroe County, it's also doubled over this period of time. So while we're going to be focusing a lot on the issue in the city of Rochester, I do want to point out that while it's much lower, this problem with poverty in our community does stretch beyond the borders of the city. In a lot of ways, it's more challenging to address it in the suburbs because it's harder to get to services. The issues we're talking about tonight with transportation are that much more challenging in the suburbs. But focusing on the city of Rochester, just to provide a picture of this, I grabbed some of the poverty rates among different groups within our community here. Children are the most likely group to be in poverty in our community. Over 50%, that's been a consistent number for years now. And that has all sorts of negative implications for development and academic success and all sorts of socio-emotional health. And it's a real crisis in our community. Poverty rate's the lowest among seniors, but still, a challenge. and almost 30% among working age adults. We do, like a lot of other cities in the north, in the Rust Belt region here, we have a great disparity in poverty between white residents in the city and Black and Hispanic residents, and it's important to point that out as well. And women are more likely to be in poverty than men, largely because they're often the ones who are caring for children, and when you have a larger household, poverty rate goes up, and there's also challenges with work and maintaining employment. So looking at poverty rates by employment status, if you're working full-time in this community, it's very unlikely to be in poverty. Some of it's just basic math. You take the minimum wage and multiply it by 40 hours a week, and you're probably going to be over the poverty line. But we do have quite high poverty rates among people who are part-time workers, and then of course those who didn't work. And I do want to also just add to this by emphasizing most of the people who aren't working, there's a lot of students in that group, there's a lot of children in that group, there's a lot of disabled in that group, there's the poverty rate among the disabled is over 50% as well. And so, it's important to focus on this. The jobs are typically the way that people aren't in poverty in our community, but there's a lot of other factors that contribute to whether someone is. So here we are. So what's preventing people from working full time? Well, one of the things we want to highlight tonight is in our community, 26% of households in Rochester don't have a single vehicle in the household. But even if you look at working households, a household with at least one person who holds a job, it's nearly as high. It's 23% in the city of Rochester. So that's, if there's one worker in the household, there's no cars. If there's two workers in the household, there's one car, and so on. And we're all in favor of reducing car dependency. We have to recognize that the reality of some of our local economy now makes it very difficult to manage this situation without a car. So where do city residents live and work? On the left there, you have a little dot map that shows where people live in the city. And on the right, you have the locations of jobs kind of in the immediate area there. So you have workers spread out all throughout the city, every part of the city. But the jobs, aside from, there's certainly a concentration of jobs still downtown. It's much lower than it used to be, but there's still a significant concentration there. You have a number of jobs down by the U of R there, and then stretching into Henrietta, which is something we're going to highlight a bit. But beyond that, you have jobs just all over the region, and that's very, very difficult for a transit system to serve. As we'll see by this very cool visualization here. So Dave Vogler, who I think may be here tonight, shared this with us. This is a visualization that's boring for a second, but then it gets really interesting on where buses, and there's a couple trains, are running within Monroe County at any moment. And you'll see most of them are concentrated within the city, and they're going in and out, as we know, the hub and spoke system there. I do like it when the trains go. But you'll see as the evening hours go on, and we get going in a minute, that they become a lot more infrequent, and it's much more difficult to access those jobs in that map that we were just looking at a moment ago. So we'll let it finish up here. Wait for what happens at about 9 o'clock. Start going in, out, in. And that's very difficult right there, that last piece, to manage a job, manage to get home from a job at that end of the shift there. So people who ride the bus to get to work, who are they? What's their profile here? So again, 54% don't have a vehicle at home. So people who are riding the bus to get to work are dependent on that bus to get to work and back. 81% are renters. 48% make less than 150% of the poverty line. This is a working class group who are trying to get to work and back on that bus there. And nearly a third have a one-way commute of more than an hour, which is a tremendous strain on a person when we talk about 20-minute commutes in this community. It's not the reality for a whole lot of people. Only 27% have a commute less than 30 minutes. And a lot of these jobs are in retail, they're in food service, they're lower paying, as we've seen with some of the statistics there. And a lot of those jobs, again, are spread out throughout our region here. So just looking at a couple examples here, we have a job at the Hyatt Regency going from the Beechwood neighborhood. That's a 20-minute commute. That's a convenient way to get to work and back. But a job at the Hilton in Henrietta is 70 minutes, and that's assuming the 70 minutes that bus arrives the moment you have to start work. If you have to get there a bit earlier, that could stretch to 90, 100 minutes there just to get to work and back. And so we have this calculation here, the cost of time that people have to factor in. If you're making $10 an hour at those two locations, but one job is taking a minimum of 2 hours and 20 minutes, whereas the other job is taking 40 minutes, your effective hourly wage is much lower than we talk about. When we talk about $10 an hour, if you're adding in the time it takes to get to work and back, that job's paying a lot less per hour you're spending on getting to work and back than you'd think. And that's eating up time that could be spent going to school, that's spending time with your family, reading to your kids, all sorts of other things that you could be spending that time on rather than riding the bus there. So why don't people just drive? Well, that's the solution for a lot of people, right? Well, because car ownership is really expensive. Just looking at the cost of owning a car, including a loan, fuel, maintenance, insurance, all that other stuff, that eats up a quarter of a low-wage worker's income before any taxes are applied, before Social Security and Medicare or anything else comes out of it. That's a lot. Even if you got the car, let's say someone handed you got the car for free or for a couple $100, it may not be reliable. It's still eating up, a little bit less than 20% of your income there, and that's a really difficult thing to manage with the fixed budget there. So for people in poverty, the trade-off between a car and a bus is you can save a lot of time with a car, but you have far less money. You're working and not bringing much home because you're spending a lot of your paycheck to own that car. And if you're riding the bus, the way we've set things up in this community, as things have kind of grown over a number of years, you are saving money, but you're losing a ton of time. And that's a real bind for a lot of people as they try to manage their lives and move forward. So just to kind of wrap it all up before we get to the film, Rochester has become more impoverished. The city's become more impoverished. Even the suburbs have become more impoverished as people and jobs have left the city. This decreasing density is a real challenge for our community. The exodus of jobs from the city to suburban locations seems to disproportionately affect low-income residents who can't afford cars or reliable transportation. And I also just want to point out, RTS's job is much more difficult when density is lower and jobs are more dispersed. It's much harder to manage a bus network when you have to deliver people to every corner of the county. So locating jobs in the city along transit lines is in itself an anti-poverty effort. It's something that I personally believe, and Reconnect Rochester believes, we should really prioritize as we move forward with a lot of these anti-poverty efforts in the community here. So that was a whole bunch. If people do have questions, I'm going to be kind of sitting on the stage a little later around some of that data, but we do want to get to the film. And you can also grab me in the hall or whatever. I'm pretty friendly. I think we're going to go with the film by Floating Homes Films here, and go with it. All right. Thank you. Thank you.